evening and welcome to the BRSI Business and Economics series. It's my great pleasure to introduce Antonio Revilla, doctor from Bath Spa University in a second. But in the meantime, maybe we can just get started on the basis of the etiquette for tonight's meeting. You know that obviously this is recorded, so if you don't want to show your face or you don't want to show your face and being recorded, then please be on the camera off. David, I'm looking at you specifically. You're the only one with the camera on at the moment. But also, please stay on mute for the duration of this presentation. When we get to the Q&A session, that will be very different. We can then actually unmute and actually ask questions in person. And in fact, there's three ways of asking a question. There is the old honored way of raising your hand when we get to the Q&A session. Alternatively, you can actually raise your hand electronically in Zoom. I'm sure you are aware of that facility. And then the third way of doing things, I'll be monitoring the chat room as we go through things through the evening. And obviously I'll pick up some questions and observations then. So I think that's all that we really need to focus on in terms of the preliminaries. It's now my great honor to introduce Antonio Revilla to you all. I'm really excited about this particular talk because we don't do enough on small businesses and particularly family businesses. You know, we talk about sort of global and international things, but it's really, really important, especially at times like COVID, when we would expect most of the bounce back after COVID to actually come from the SME sector and the family businesses. So just to give you a little bit of background into Antonio's history. Antonio joined Bath Spa University as a senior lecturer in business management in April 2016. He had previously developed his academic career at Carlos III University in Spain for more than 10 years. His teaching includes entrepreneurship and the application of design thinking to successful business innovation. His expertise bridges the fields of entrepreneurship, strategic management, and innovation management, with a focus on sustainable value creation as the ultimate source of competitive advantage. He has also published world-class research in the field of family business, including the most read article on Family Business Review in 2016 to 17. His current research projects explore the ability of firms, particularly new ventures and SMEs, to integrate dispersed sources of technological knowledge into an effective and efficient information process. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Antonio. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andres, for the presentation, introduction. Thank you very much to the BRLSI for inviting me today. It is a great pleasure to be joining you in this online lecture. And it's also a great pleasure seeing quite a few friendly faces joining us this evening. Thank you very much to all of you for coming tonight. Let me just start sharing my screen. I'm as Andrew just said, I'm a lecturer, so basically that means I do PowerPoint. I do much more than PowerPoint, but I do PowerPoint. So I will go through this presentation in the next 45 minutes or so. And then there will be time for Q&As and hopefully for some discussion on the topic for today. The title of the talk is "I Will Survive: The Survival Advantage of Family Firms." Just first a disclaimer: I'm afraid we are not expecting Gloria Gaynor tonight, so you are stuck with me. And please believe me when I say that you don't want to hear me sing. So I will just do the talking. The topic of being survival, right? Let me start. If we're talking about survival, I think it makes sense if we start by defining what we are talking about, right? What do we mean by survival? In the simplest terms, we can define business failure as a company ceasing operations because of its inability to make a profit or to make enough profit, more on that later, or to generate enough cash so it can actually pay the bills, right? The other way around, we define survival as just the opposite of that, as continuity of operations, right? The company going on. So it's dying or surviving, ceasing operations or continuity of the business. However, quite often, and that's the case of my own research in which this talk is largely based, we also define failure often as bankruptcy declaration, even though it doesn't necessarily imply the ceasing of operations of the business. Business may actually stay alive and make it through a bankruptcy process, but it's definitely kind of an existential threat to a business. Right? So quite often just going through bankruptcy is also considered as a failure event for a business. But for the most part, when we're talking about survival or failure, we're talking about going on, continuity, or just ceasing operations of the business. I guess the question then it's, does it really matter? Should we really care about business survival or failure? Well, if I was a free market libertarian, which I am not, the answer would most certainly be no. Right? The libertarian view is that in a free market economy, competition sets the rules and the outcomes, and it's seen as survival of the fittest, which basically means that when a business disappears, when a business fails, that's just the outcome of a competitive market. It only fails because it isn't good enough or successful enough, and it's perfectly okay just to let it fall and to let new business enterprises replace it in the market, right? And that's how actually the market and economy advance. Moreover, also from the point of view of the business and the business stockholders, quite often, not quite often, but sometimes failure is the best possible outcome considering the situation, because keeping a business afloat, keeping it alive, may be very costly to them. So the short answer would be, well, failure happens. It's a natural thing in a competitive economy, and it's okay. We have to live with that. We will let some businesses fail so some others can actually flourish. However, but if you want, and there's a big however here, things are not that simple. And that's one of the reasons why I'm saying I'm not a free market libertarian. And the economy doesn't work in these terms so simple. Businesses quite often have some value as institutions, some value to the community they are part of. And it's not just a matter of, they're not so easily replaceable by some others. More often, failure, and we're going to be discussing that, is not only an event that has financial implications or economic implications, it also has social and emotional implications for everyone involved, and we have to take that into account. And finally, competition is not always a survival of the fittest. It isn't always as if it is the weakest or the worst you want, or the least successful businesses that fail. Things may happen that may present an existential struggle for a business, even if they are perfectly competitive and perfectly viable in the long term. And we are just going through one of them, right? an external shock, in this case caused by the COVID pandemic, that has put many businesses in the brink of failure. And not because they were not perfectly competitive and successful businesses before, because something happened that was well beyond their control. In this situation, this view of failure being a natural outcome of competition, it just doesn't work. So, as usual, things are more complicated than many economists are willing to acknowledge in a mainstream discourse. Excuse me. Let me elaborate on some of the things I've just said. And I think the first thing I want to do today is kind of challenge the usual view that we have of failure of a business or business just going, or a company just going out of business. Oh, sorry, before that, totally forgot about this, excuse me. Well, business failure, unfortunately, is a current topic nowadays, and it's in the mind of everyone because there's been a huge disruption to the economy, and many businesses are facing the consequences of that. The latest Business Insights and Conditions survey that the ONS runs every 2 weeks shows that nearly 9% of businesses express low or no confidence that they will survive the next 3 months. That's the bad news, and that's over 500,000 businesses. That's a lot. The good news, I guess, is that this figure is down from 15.1% in January. I don't know if it's down because many businesses have already failed, but I don't think that's the case. I think also the outlook is more positive now, and we all experience that. So it's death, if you want, is something that, an outcome that many businesses are currently facing as a possibility. On the other hand, statistics show that bankruptcies are down actually in the last year, and having quite low since March 2020, unlike you would normally expect in a situation of crisis. And that's due basically to the intervention of the government and of governments almost worldwide to support businesses and keep them going. There has been a huge injection of financial support for businesses, and there have also been temporary restrictions on statutory demands, stopping companies to actually go bankrupt. What we don't have yet is data on enterprise deaths over the period of the pandemic. The latest data I found that they are published, they are from the second quarter of 2020, and they still didn't show an increase in business mortality in those 3 months. Businesses that had been disrupted by the pandemic, they were still going on. We will see what the effect is when we have more data on business demography, right, on births and deaths of new enterprises. But I guess the bottom line here is that, yeah, of course there's a big crisis, and of course there's an existential threat to many businesses, but so far it seems like the UK, and actually I would say many countries, have managed to press the pause button to the economy rather than the stop button to the economy. So we are keeping the business fabric there, even if sometimes it's in hibernation, and with a substantial cost for public finances, of course, but it's still there. We still can't see a big effect on business mortality of the pandemic, at least not with the available data. The question, of course, is what is going to happen in the long term, right? When things restart, when all the support programs are finished, what is going to happen with many businesses that have been suffering quite a lot in the last year. Moreover, many changes in the competitive environment caused by the COVID pandemic are here to stay. And the landscape is going to change for many, many companies. What the effects will be, we still don't know. But that's kind of the context in which we are right now. That being said, let me go to a point that I mentioned before. I would like to kind of challenge quite a standard view of what failure actually is and what failure actually means for a business. You know, quite often we have a view of failure or death that is a bit like this. Right? It's something that happens. It's an outcome. It's something that we don't want, right? We have to assume that no one wants to see their business fail. So it's basically an outcome, something that happens to a business, even though we don't want. But it's not like there's nothing that can be done about it, or there's not something that we don't have any say on. I think this metaphor of just running off a cliff and just falling and dying is not exactly how failure happens. I think it's a much more accurate metaphor of what business failure is. There's Mount Everest there. It's like climbing a mountain. So when you climb a mountain, it's an enterprise. It's a big venture in the same way as a new business is. Well, you can keep going, and you keep going as long as the environmental conditions allow, and as long as your own skills and strength allows. Same with the business. But if you're doing okay, you keep going. And eventually something may happen that may pose a big threat for your venture, for your expedition. Maybe change in the weather, change in the snow conditions, an avalanche, or maybe just your forces fail you, right? You just can't go on, right? You're feeling weak. Well, that's when you have to make a decision there. You keep going, or do you turn back? So failing, if you want, in a climbing expedition is to some extent an outcome, something that happens, but also to some extent is a decision that people have to make, that the expedition leader has to make, whether to keep going or to just turn their backs to the mountain and go home. It's quite similar to the kind of decisions that business managers are facing. If things are going well, they keep going. If there's a challenge there, if there are some problems ahead, well, it's the time to decide whether you want to keep going and push harder and try to find the resources to keep going. And that has a cost or may have a cost. Or whether just to say, this is it, we're going home. Right? And of course, the outcomes may actually be very different. So some people actually are very successful and they do okay and they manage to get to the top and back. That's Edmund Hillary and Tenzin Sherpa there, the first people to climb Mount Everest. Some people also are successful, you want, and they keep going and they make it to the top and back. And that's Maurice Herzog there, the leader of the French expedition climbing Annapurna in 1950, the first 18,000-meter mountain to ever be climbed. And the expedition was a success in a way. They made it to the top and back alive, barely alive. At a high cost. They made the decision to keep going, and the cost for Maurice Herzog, in particular, was that he lost all his fingers and all his toes, and he never ever climbed again. And of course, sometimes the decision of keeping going means that it has a very high cost and it has really tragical consequences. You probably know the two men in this photo. They are George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, members of the 1924 British expedition to Mount Everest, who died trying to reach the summit. Well, according to some people, they died in the way back down from the summit, but there's no evidence of that. I think this kind of a much more accurate metaphor of what business failure is and what it entails. It is an outcome, it is something that happens, and it's not a desirable outcome, but it's also a decision that businesses have to make in the face of difficulty. So let's try to understand what the decision actually is. And there's a concept in the business literature that is the minimum performance threshold. So basically that means that if your business is below that minimum threshold of performance, you are not making a good profit, you're underperforming. If you want, you just decide it's worth it and you go back home, right? You close down and you move on to something else. If you are above that minimum performance threshold, well, things are going well, you are making a profit, there's a good return on your investment, you keep going. For those of you who are financially minded, this could be it, basically. So the easiest equation there is that if the return on the capital employed is higher than the weighted average cost of capital, all is good, you go ahead. In other terms, if the return on your investment is greater than the cost of the capital you're investing, which basically means the money you could make the return you could make investing that money anywhere else, all is good. When we're talking about the opposite, well, things are not quite good, right? If the return you're getting is not enough to cover the cost of your investment, you may want to just cease the operations of the business. For you, those of you who are even more financially minded, things are a bit more complicated because we are talking about the future. It's not just about whether you are making enough of a profit now. It's about whether you think that your business is going to be profitable in the future. If the money you're going to make next year and the year after and the year after, when you bring them to the present, you calculate the net present value of the business, it's a good investment or not. And that's what you have there in the second formula there. It's a formula for the expected net present value of the investment of the business. You can forget about the formula. The idea is that if it's a good investment, you go on. If it isn't, you stop. Well, there's a big first issue here. When we're looking to the future, we're talking about expectations. And how people form their expectations of the future of the business is not a trivial problem. But I'm not getting into that today. I'm going to something else. The idea that failure for a business is not just a financial decision. It's not just about profit. It is not about money. It is, but not only. The idea that failure often involves significant non-financial costs. There are social costs. There are emotional costs involved, right? And that's the truth for actually every business and for managers of any business out there. And this idea of this minimum performance threshold basically comes to explain evidence that researchers have found about businesses with similar performance, and some of them keep going, some of them actually cease operations, right? Because different people have different performance thresholds here. How does this matter for a family business, which is the specific field that I was interested when I analyzed business survival, and the topic for a session today. But it all comes to the very unusual nature of what a family business is. Well, first, let me just clarify one thing. They are not necessarily small businesses. Many of them are. Not all of the small businesses are family businesses, most of them are, but actually many large businesses are family businesses, right? Here in the Southwest, we have examples, or we could call Thatcher's not a small business, but it's a family business, or Dyson, we can think of it as a family business, for example, right? So what is a family business? Is it a family-owned business that we're talking about, or is it a family-managed, a family-run business we are talking about? There are different ways in which the family and the business can be related. The most important thing of a family business, what actually defines it and what makes it interesting from the point of view of research and the study of how they behave, is that you can't really understand the family business without understanding the family that runs it. You can't analyze the decisions of that business without getting to know who the family that controls the business are, what they want, what their values are, what their culture is. And that's actually quite unique, because as business scholars, we tend to look at businesses from the perspective of the business, right? In a family company, a family firm, we have to look at the business also from the point of view of the family, right? And trying to understand the family. So in order to define a family business, things are not trivial, actually. What is in a family business? There's a scale that measures family business in 3 dimensions, and that's the FPEG model. The idea is that a family business is an enterprise in which there's one family that exerts significant influence. And it does because they have the power to do so, because they have a stake in the ownership of the company, or the governance of the company, or the management of the company. So they have the ability to incorporate their own agenda to the business. Also, there's a family experience that is incorporated into the business. And that has to do with the number of family members involved and the number of generations involved. But third is a cultural element. Normally, people who work for a family business know it's a family business, and they don't have to think about the structure of capital of who is managing the business. They know it is, because they know the values and commitment of the company and the family. So that's the main thing, right? We need to understand the family. We want to understand the business. How does this matter for business survival? Well, perhaps the first and the most important consequence of what I just said before about what a family business is that setting goals, setting shared and agreed goals in a family business is complicated. It can be complicated. It can be difficult for any business, but even more so for a family enterprise. Why? Because there are many different interests in place. You've got the business-related goals, right? The objectives of the business itself. The ones that make sense from the point of view of who is managing the business and wants the best for the business. Some of them might be financial goals, profit, return on investment, growth. Some of them may be non-financial goals, reputation, customer loyalty, employee satisfaction, things that as a manager, I would think that would make the business work better. So they are important goals for my family business. We have to keep them in mind. But there are also the goals that are related to the family. The family has its own agenda, and that's natural thing to do. They want to boost the career prospects of the new generation of family members. They want to protect their social relationships, and quite often many of them are related to the business. They may want to keep the harmony and the peace within the family. They may want to keep the control of the company, right? So managers in a family business have to juggle all these different goals, and it's quite a difficult balance to achieve sometimes. This means for the point of view of the survival of the business, sometimes this may actually be a problem, because it may happen that companies, managers in a family business are making decisions that are actually jeopardizing the viability of the business in the long term. For example, they may not want to incorporate external investors that could help fund the company if the family doesn't want if the family wants to protect or to keep the control of the business. That's what researchers have called protecting their own socio-emotional wealth, the socio-emotional wealth of the family. That's important when you're managing a business, and sometimes they may lead to a clash with the interests of the business itself, and that may jeopardize their viability and their survival. On the other hand, and this is a more common view if you want, the idea is that family businesses tend to have a survival advantage, and that's actually the title of my talk today, the survival advantage of the family business. The idea is as follows. For a controlling family, keeping the business going is important because of the social and emotional costs of failure. It's critical for them to keep it going. Because it is when the business is struggling, when the survival of the business is at stake, they are willing to go the extra mile for the business in a way that normally stockholders or managers of a non-family business wouldn't be willing to. And that they may be willing to incur in costs that some others wouldn't be willing to. They may be willing to risk their fingers and their toes just to keep the enterprise going. And that may take the form of loan or free labor. You can work for free for the company if it's needed. You can contribute your network. You can contribute what is called patient financial capital. So investors from a family business may be willing to wait longer to see a return on their investment if that helps keep the company going. They may be willing to invest more of their own wealth into the business if it's needed. They may lend money to the business. So they may be willing to contribute all their resources. They will pool their family resources to keep the business afloat. That's what is called sometimes the survivability capital of a family business. So there's this balance in which there are some arguments suggesting that the family may be a liability for the business eventually, but also the family can prove to be a safety net for the business if needed. And that's something that interested my co-authors and myself when we were doing this research. I will tell you a bit more about the actual research and the results a bit later. But I think what we have seen so far kind of help us pose some important questions for family business to reflect on, or for anyone who is involved with family businesses in different capacities. What does failure mean for the business and for the family? Is it mainly something financial, or is it mostly an emotional and psychological and social problem? What is the performance threshold for the company, and why? How does all the above affect the decisions the business is making? What would the company be willing to sacrifice if needed to avoid or postpone failure? Right? I have no answer to these questions, but I tend to tell my students that quite often I can't give them answers, or I'm not even expecting answers from them, as long as they ask themselves the right questions. I just taking them already halfway there. So these are important questions. Something that interested me in my research is that families can participate in their businesses in different ways. They may be involved in different ways. In some cases, it's just ownership. They have a stake in the capital of the company, bigger or smaller. They have invested their wealth in the company, so it's a family-owned business. So if you want, they are passive in the company. They're not involved in running the company on a daily basis. They may delegate that into external managers. But some other families are really involved in managing the business. It's not just owning, it's actually running the business themselves. And of course, when they are doing that, that means that their own careers are at stake if the business fails. That means that there are stronger emotional bonds between family members, family managers, and the business than there would be with if they are just investors. It may bring this failure stigma onto the family if things go wrong. Right? If there's an association of the company, the representation of the family and the business, if the business fails, and some people lose their jobs, that may actually affect the reputation of the company, more so if they're involved in management. And finally, when companies are involved in running the businesses, it means that the professional and personal networks of the family are more and more entangled with the business activity. In other words, all the above means that the more involved the family is in the company, and the more involved the family is in the management of the company, these social and emotional and even the financial costs of failure become higher. So they will have greater incentives to try to keep the business going, to act as a safety net for the business. And that's basically what my colleagues and I analyzed in a sample of Spanish family firms. I will go on to that in say 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes. That about family business itself. But there was another thing that we found interesting when it came to understanding survival of a business. And there's another key variable that we looked at and we thought, well, we want to know more about this. And that's the concept of what is called entrepreneurial orientation. And that's the entrepreneurial orientation, EO, if you want, or corporate entrepreneurship, or intrapreneurship is quite a common concept in the academic literature, but it's not so well known out of academia. But the idea is actually quite simple. A company is entrepreneurially oriented if they are really willing to be innovative, launch new products, new services, new processes into the market. They do that proactively. So they want to take the lead instead of react to what the competitors are doing. And in so doing, they are willing to take risks. They're willing to take risks. Right? And the three dimensions are related. There are companies that they really want to be first in the market. They want to be leaders in the market. They are taking risks in order to do that. They are launching innovations. And that's normally seen as a positive thing. Right? It's meant to be something good for a company, and that's a common narrative. You know, you have to be entrepreneurial in order to survive and to thrive. Why? Because that's going to make you competitive in the long term, and that's going to help you adapt to an environment that is changing. And well, they give you some good perspective for long term. You have to think ahead of your market. This view is what is called their EO, entrepreneurial orientation as advantage. And that's quite a common view. But there's another way of looking at that. Well, if you want to be very entrepreneurial and look for innovativeness and being proactive and taking risks, you're venturing into the unknown. You are increasing your risk. by definition, you are dealing with uncertainty. You may disperse your profit from what you really know for your business, what you're really doing well, into new ventures that may or may not work. You are experimenting with your business, which means that you may increase actually the risks of failure. Right? So again, there's a balance there between being innovative and being entrepreneurial as an advantage, as something that will ensure the long-term viability of the business, and be innovative as taking risks that may jeopardize the business. And as a researcher, whenever I find things that are unclear, and you can have arguments going one way or another, well, that's kind of natural. It's a natural reaction to think, well, I want to know more. What I've said so far is based on, it's kind of a summary of part of the literature on this topic: on business survival, on family business, on entrepreneurial orientation. And well, myself and my co-authors, we took arguments from all these areas, we put them together in basically what I've told you so far, and we derived some hypotheses from it, and we tested all this in a sample of businesses. Right? We conducted some field research, and the whole point of that research was trying to put everything together, and that hadn't been analyzed before. What happens when you analyze the effect of entrepreneurial orientation within a family managed business? How different is it from other kinds of businesses? And that's something that really interested us, because it wasn't clear. You know, on the one hand, for many businesses, the advice is, if you want to be competitive, you have to be entrepreneurial. Fair enough. But what happens with the family business? What happens with that safety net? What's the problem of trying to be innovative and change things in a family business? Well, quite often, whatever you want to do new may clash or may challenge the views, the culture, and the values of the controlling family, right? You may have to fight the controlling family if you want to change the way the business does things, more so than you would have to do with non-family businesses. And they may cause conflict within the company, which in itself is not a bad thing. I'm going to say something about that now. But what happens when conflict in a family business? Are family businesses better suited to manage and deal with conflict, with different views, and with new ways of doing things, and with challenging ideas than non-family business? Well, we didn't know. We had an idea of what could happen there, but we didn't really know. A word on conflict now. Conflict for a business can be a good thing or a bad thing. There are different ways of looking at this. Perhaps the simplest one is being able to separate first task conflict. And task conflict arises when different people have different views on how to do something. And that's good for a business. It is good, because that's how better ideas arise. That's how better decisions are made, by managing that task conflict, by managing those different views, and in a way in which they are incorporated into some debate and decisions are made. So in itself, conflict isn't a bad thing. When is conflict a bad thing? When things get personal. When task conflict becomes relational conflict. In task conflict, I can say, I don't agree with you. In relational conflict, I would say, you are useless. I don't want to work with you. And when that happens, organizations can get extremely dysfunctional. The point of this is that we have reasons to believe that there's some risk, some greater risk that task conflict will become relational conflict in family businesses, in family managed businesses. Because work and personal relationships are so closely intertwined that it's hard to separate them. If that was the case, we presume that perhaps family managed businesses were not as well prepared as other businesses to really deal with the conflict that being very entrepreneurial and challenging ideas might provoke. Again, a few questions for reflection for a family business. Does the family play an active role in managing the business? Have you ever heard this is not how we do things here when trying to innovate? How is conflict managed within the company? Do business-related disagreements affect family relationships, or maybe vice versa? So, how may your answers here, talking about conflict, about family managed business may affect your answers to the question before about survival? Well, just leaving these there for reflection. A few words on what we did in terms of research. This is a research that we completed a few years ago. We published that in a journal, and that's something that I hadn't revisited until recently. But right now, basically because of COVID and the challenge that it has posed for many businesses and for the economy, I've become interested into again, right? Looking at this again, because I think we are in a unfortunately nice scenario to understand decisions on business survival. We looked at a couple of Spanish manufacturing firms. I was working in Spain back then, in the context of the financial crisis. And the context of the financial crisis meant that many businesses failed, disappeared, went bankrupt. And many of the businesses, even though they survived, they saw their performance really affected. You know, if you see this graph here, it's the curve of unemployment in Spain in the crisis. That it fits surprisingly well the shape of the Himalayas in this image. That's Mount Everest again. I'm not interested in this specific sample, in this specific context. I'm interested in lessons that I think we can extract that might be applied to different contexts and might be applied to what we might be about to see in the UK and in many countries as a result of COVID. Luckily, it seems that from the point of view of public support to businesses, we have learned some lessons since 2008, but we don't know what will happen when things go back to normal. I won't bore you with the details of the results and the statistics, the econometrics. I think I'm talking more than enough already, but just let me go through kind of the main findings there. Well, the first one is that, well, we seem to confirm that business failure is as much as a decision as it is an outcome. I have argued about that before. We did find, indeed, that businesses that are family run, so in which family members are involved in managing the business, tended to survive more, or they were more likely to survive the financial crisis. So we found some evidence for this idea of a survivability advantage of a family business, of the family actually helping the company keep going when things get really tough, which we kind of expected, but wasn't obvious at all, because there are some arguments on the contrary, as I said before. We also found that being entrepreneurial, being innovative, being proactive, helped companies survive in the context of financial crisis. They help them make it through the crisis. So we kind of found support for this idea of entrepreneurial orientation as an advantage. However, we also found that effect was much smaller for companies that were family run. In other words, that being entrepreneurial, innovative, taking risks didn't mix very well with being family run in terms of promoting survival of the business. Why? Well, we don't know for sure. We didn't have information to really evaluate that for sure. And that's actually one of the things I would love to do in the future. And I'm going to say a few words about that later. We could, however, suggest some plausible explanations. The one that I said before is that maybe being entrepreneurial within the family business may erode the consensus of the family. They may create conflict, and they may make some family members less willing to really contribute resources to the business and take the cost of accepting the cost of keeping the business going. Or it may be because family-run businesses lack some management skills to really be successful when it comes to innovation, right? And they need the expertise and the views and the experience of external managers. The key idea here is that managing this thing, managing the relationship between being a family business, being family-run, and trying to innovate successfully and being proactive in the market can be a key issue for the long-term viability of the family business. You may need to be able to innovate and to be entrepreneurial to keep going, but also you need to do it in a way in which you manage that within the context of the family business. How? Well, that's easier said than done, but it's again a big topic for a business. Perhaps more importantly, our findings, the questions that it opened, and I was reflecting on them before today when I was going through the slides again, preparing this lecture, and thinking of research that perhaps could address some of these questions. The question is, when is the family an asset and when a liability for the business and for the survival of the business? Our findings in the context of the financial crisis suggest that it was an asset. Some other research in different contexts, basically not a crisis, suggested that it might be a liability because of this promotion of their own socio-emotional wealth over the business goals. Understanding what kind of factors influence this balance between the family being good for the business survival and the family not being so good for the business survival is interesting. And I don't think this is well understood yet. If we understand that, we might try to get the best of both worlds. What can family businesses learn about the way in which non-family, I don't like the distinction between family and non-family because it's not black or white, but just to simplify. What can family businesses learn from non-family businesses in terms of innovating for survival? What can non-family businesses learn in terms of long-term orientation and commitment and the ability of gathering new resources when it's needed to keep the business going? Can we have the best of both worlds? In the same way, when is entrepreneurial orientation an advantage and when a threat for the survival of the business? We found it was an advantage. Funnily enough, as far as I know, this is the only paper that finds that entrepreneurial orientation is an advantage for survival. And I know at least a couple of them that find the opposite. The companies that take the risk of being entrepreneurial are less likely to survive precisely because they are taking risks. I think some of the explanation may come from the context of our research. We looked at companies before the crisis and then we tracked their survival throughout the crisis. So what we found is that companies that had really making the most of the good times to really invest in the future long term were more likely to survive a financial crisis. But honestly, I don't know what the answer to this question is, but there's mixed evidence there. And finally, something that it may be worth considering is, when is business failure a burden and when a relief? In this balance before, in which we found that sometimes business failure is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's needed for competition, and it's needed for the economy to move forward, as new businesses come to replace failed ones. And sometimes failure is not necessarily bad for the stockholders, and maybe sometimes for some stakeholders of the company, because they let them move on to more successful and more ventures with more potential. But sometimes it is. Sometimes business failure has big consequences for the economy, for employment, for stockholders, for all the different stakeholders involved, sometimes for the local community. Well, what kind of factors actually influence that decision? That, I don't think that's very well understood either. So I just wanted to finish leaving these questions for up in the air, and maybe just opening the session to questions from the floor, from the virtual floor. That's all from me. Thank you very much for listening the last 55 minutes or so, 50 minutes or so. And well, I will be more than happy to listen to your comments, your questions, or anything. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Antonio, and thank you very much for all the insight into small businesses and small business decision making. Very much appreciated. Maybe we can, we're only a select bunch today, so maybe we can all unmute ourselves and give Antonio a big round of applause for taking us through the survivability of businesses. Excellent. See, this is nice. Even with Zoom, which is a bit sterile and two-dimensional sometimes, you can still hear the claps, Antonio. So the applause. So that's good. We now come to the Q&A session. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there's three ways of asking a question. One, by just raising your hand and asking it. Second one is by raising your hand electronically in Zoom. And finally, in the chat room. And there's a few questions in the chat room. But before we get into the chat room, maybe we start off with some live questions first, and then we'll go into the chat room afterwards. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question? Ben, well done. You're the first one. This was the hardest.
Thanks very much. So thanks very much, Antonio, for a very interesting talk. Well, mine was a little bit of a techie question, so I hesitate to put it in as first one. But I was interested in coming back to the question you talked about, ownership and management, or ownership and control, I guess we could say. That the businesses that you select or can be identified as being family run have to be ones that have I'm thinking a major ownership stake, which is vested in the family. But then the level of professionalized control of that, obviously the family can decide whether to bring in experts externally, etc. And I was just interested in the variations that might be there between particularly larger businesses that might need that extra professional input in a managerial level, and smaller businesses who might feel they can always carry on with just family input in terms of the controlled element. So I'm guessing that the baseline has to be ownership status of the business is a smallish collective of family members of some kind. But then the step from that to management control as such, and how far that's seeded. Just interested in your kind of reflections on that in relation to your overall research, if that's a reasonable question.
Thanks, Ben. I'm glad you asked that question. That's actually a very good question, and a very tricky one, I have to say. It all comes to the definition of what a family business is. And not just how to define it, but also how to operationalize it. So how to measure that. How can we say this is a family business, this isn't a family business? And that's a wicked problem. And there's no easy answer to that. And well, I can reveal that we had some issues with that in the previous versions of our research when we tried to submit that to a journal, and the reviewers came back saying we don't buy it. So we kind of sidestepped the whole issue, and something that is perhaps not very clear in my talk. We had kind of 400 Spanish companies, manufacturing companies. They were not family businesses or non-family businesses. They were just businesses. They were not selected for their family status. They were selected based on their activity, their size, and well, their willingness to actually reply to our questionnaire. And then we don't say in the sample, this is a family business, this is not a family business. We measure as a continuum family ownership. What percentage of the capital of the company is controlled by a single family? And we measure family management as a continuum. How many managers of the company belong to the controlling family? So that's basically, we don't go and say, this is it. This is family, this is non-family. What we find, if you keep that in mind, the implication for our results is that we found that a single family having a greater share in the capital of the company, in the equity of the company, didn't really have any effect for our purposes. However, having more family members involved in the management of the company did seem to have an effect, increasing the chances of survival. Did you manage to answer the question?
Yes, yeah, thank you very much, Antonio. That's very, very helpful. Yes, that's very useful. Yeah, so as it's kind of what I had a vague intuition might be related to that I'm thinking of very big companies like Sainsbury's that have, a number of very big family ownership of blocks of shares, but they're not really involved in the day-to-day decisions. And occasionally they may decide to vote en bloc for certain prevention of certain sorts of key decisions, but they're generally not very much involved in a lot of administration type stuff, etc. So yeah, so thanks. That was really, really interesting to get. That's so that say that those two components are both on a spectrum. So in a sense, you're having to look at the overall correlations across that rather than as you say a percentage either way. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
It always helps to unmute, doesn't it? Yes, I suppose the more family members are actually actively engaged in the business, I think what Antonio is saying is the survivability is going to be more likely, rather than being somebody who's over a family member who's absent in the business. So I think that's pretty clear. Okay, next, does anybody else want to ask another question before I go into the chat room and read some of them out? Yes, Polly.
Hi, Antonio and everyone. It's an observation, really, and I wondered what your response might be. And it's around the socio-emotional wealth, which I found really interesting. As I also found the Everest explanation just brilliant, actually. So I might use that, if I may, with your permission, in other places. But the socio-emotional wealth is really interesting, and it reminds me very much of what I would call the grassroots organisations, where there tends to be a sort of a hidden culture. I call it the slippery fish, really. It's quite hard to be able to quantify. It's quite hard to be able to explain. And it's around those family goals versus the business goals. And I wondered if some of your findings can be very transferable to the sort of the grassroots organisations, the smaller organisations that come from that sort of hidden passion and hidden cultures. Because it just seems to tie up really, really well. There's an awful lot that you were saying that made me kind of go, gave me sudden light bulb moments. And I wondered if you had come across this sort of these thoughts before, whether that's come up before.
Thanks very much, Polly. First of all, please feel free to use the Everest metaphor.
Thank you.
we need to create some shared base of knowledge. And metaphors. I once heard a colleague talk to students about dinosaurs, chameleons, and caterpillars when it came to entrepreneurship and dealing with change. Basically, dinosaurs were not able to adapt, so they disappeared. Chameleons adapt; they are reactive. While caterpillars, they don't adapt to change; they are the change, right? They lead the change. Well, I'm saying that because I used that for years afterwards. So yes, we have to borrow things from each other, of course.
I'll use that too.
Yeah, I don't think he's in Spain, so I don't think he will find out. So that's all right. No, I haven't thought of that actually, how that might affect or how much that translate into these grassroots organizations. But I think we have a nice paper to be written there, right? Guess to some extent that links to your idea of the tradition, right? We tend to talk, and I'm the first one saying that, so much about innovation, the need to adapt, the need to reinvent ourselves, to keep ahead of the market. So that's kind of the typical business narrative, right? That's also, this is not mine, there's also in business use the narrative of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonder, actually Alice Through the Mirror, in which Alice needs to keep running just to stay in the same place, not to move anywhere. So we keep talking about this idea to keep running, but sometimes for some organizations, maybe the strength is what they are doing now. And it's not that they struggle to change, it's that they shouldn't. Right? It's very difficult for them to innovate or be entrepreneurial or adapt or change without losing the essence of what makes them valuable. I don't know, honestly, I'm really glad that you brought that up, but I don't really have an answer. I think it's very important, an interesting reflection to make.
Okay, well, there you go. Trevor, you're next.
Yes, Antonio, excuse me. I put this question in the chat room, but maybe I can ask it. I know from the work from the International Institute of Management Development, IMD, in Switzerland, their family business units that they've done. One of the biggest things that most family businesses are worried about is survival in terms of survival to the second, third and beyond generation, because the record is not good for big businesses or small businesses. Not many really survive. You look at the total world, especially in some countries, especially in the USA, not many survive beyond the second or third generation. And that's the biggest worry for them, because all the pros and the cons that you pointed out, family businesses, absolutely valid, but they get exaggerated when you get to the second and third generation. So what's your experience of the companies that you've worked for about their worries for the second and third generation?
Right. That's actually a very good, interesting question. And it helps me kind of bring up a topic that explains a bit what my research was about and what it wasn't about. There are kind of two different things, right? There's some research about the family business survival as a family business, so they remain within the family, and that's a big concern for many families and many businesses, because they want to pass it on to the second and third generation. And there's survival of the family business as a business versus just going bankrupt or going under. We kind of looked at the second one. We didn't look at whether businesses kept going but stopped being a family business. So basically, some external investors took over the controlling family, and they ceased to be a family business, which is kind of a different problem. What my experience is, it's a big topic. Well, there's a whole field of research about succession, how it is organized, succession, and how it is run, and basically, I guess the headline of that is that a big factor there is planning ahead, planning for succession well ahead, well before it happens. It's a big thing when the business passes into the second generation. Then apart from that, there are some interesting results that have to do with the survival of the business as we are looking at it, that show that sometimes that improves in the second generation. And the idea is that you bring more expertise and more views and sometimes more professionalization into the business, but then the third generation is not really the problem. It's not really the big problem. I'm not saying that it's always like that, and kind of one of the first things that one finds in the literature on family businesses, they're very diverse and very heterogeneous. But normally it's the third generation that is a big problem for a company, and it makes sense, right? Because once you've got cousins involved, and there are many people involved, it's very difficult to keep this idea of a shared view of the company. Kind of gets the identity between the family, the goals, the views, the values, and the business. It gets lost. It may happen in the second generation, but it's typically the third. And normally it's the time when most businesses, or before the third generation, when most families exit the business, which is in itself a totally different process, right? And exit strategies and planning for exit is also very important. That's what kind of comes to mind now. I'm sure there's a lot more because it's a big topic in the family business literature, but it's not exactly something we look at in this research.
Okay, thank you for that, Antonio. And Ian, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Antonio. If you look at the banking industry, which I'm quite familiar with, and you go back to 1880, the two biggest banking families in the world were the House of Rothschild and the House of Morgan. And over the last 140 years, and they were actually, in terms of capital and things, about the same size, about 1880 apparently. If you roll forward 140 years, the House of Rothschild has remained a family business. It is, and it's concentrated on survival. And it is a perfectly respectable corporate finance and wealth management business across Europe. Gross income about 2 billion euros. So they really have survived. But if you look at the House of Morgan, which embraced the public listing and became a public company, it has spawned into two organizations, JP Morgan, which is one of the biggest banks in the world, and Morgan Stanley, which is one of the most successful investment banks in the world. Doesn't that kind of seem to suggest that in the long term, the ability to attract capital, the disciplines of being a public company, etc., are better for the economy?
Maybe, maybe that's kind of the prevailing view of the academics that work on this idea of socio-emotional wealth. And actually, there's a very good paper on socio-emotional wealth that is called something like the bond that ties, and the idea is that sometimes the links between the family and the business are kind of tying all the managers. They are stopping them from making the best decisions for the business and making them grow. So they are missing out on opportunities. It may be the case. Yes, definitely. And actually, problems of accessing to capital or growth is one of the main issues that family businesses face, because basically family members they may not want to relinquish control to external investors, and that may stop them from trying, for example, going public and getting funding. And also, the supervision of the market is something that they may not be willing to accept. And that's the whole idea of the socio-emotional wealth. Basically saying that they want to protect their own empire and their own dynasty, even though that may be against the interests of the business. And the economy. Whether that's always the case or not, well, I couldn't tell. I think there's probably something to be said for the value of keeping this family identity, and also there are family businesses that are public actually, and because that's a different thing. Not all the families behave in the same way. Some families are willing to accept that the business may need to go public. They may need to bring external investors, and they may still keep some control and some identity of the business, even though less so than families that keep the business private. So it's a very good question. I think it makes perfect sense, and that's basically the whole idea of socio-emotional wealth as a limitation for businesses, for family businesses. But I'm sure there are counterexamples there. So not always, but definitely sometimes it is the case. Yes.
Okay. Well, it sounds as if the family business's critical success factors are not just about binary, like maximizing profit or market share. So maybe that's got something to do with it. Anybody else for any more questions? Okay, Nicola, you asked a question in the chat room. Do you want me to read it out, or do you want to ask it yourself, Nicola?
Thanks, Andreas, and hi, Antonio. My question really related to non-financial goals and socio-economic wealth, and I wondered if there was any evidence or suggestion that when times got tough, non-financial goals, such as providing jobs for all the family members, investing in communities, and reluctance to make redundancies amongst family businesses, were put on hold and shelved to prioritise financial goals, including survival.
Yes, another very good question. There may be not direct evidence that I'm aware of regarding non-financial versus financial goals, but there is indeed strong evidence that suggests that may be the case, and that's kind of a very similar scenario, but with slightly different question. There's research showing that family businesses, when things are going well, may be less risk averse. They may be more risk averse and less willing to invest in R&D and innovation because they don't need to, and they want to keep things safe. However, when things get really, really tough and the survival of the business is at stake, and they feel that there's a big stress and they need to do something about it, or they will lose the business, things are kind of the opposite. They engage in more risky behavior. They are more willing to be bold, if you want, just to keep the business going. So it's the whole idea of what is called a mixed gamble in the literature. So it's true, it is totally true, and there's evidence, and there are very good arguments for this, that when you compare the way the family business and non-family business behave, what is true in a normal scenario may actually be the opposite when they are as you say in terms of stress. There's evidence suggesting that is the case, for example, with innovation, R&D, and risk taking. And I will assume that's also the case with non-financial and financial goals. Yes, that makes perfect sense. So yes, there's some evidence suggesting this is the case, and there's definitely evidence showing that they behave differently in terms of stress, and what we observe in calm times is not the same that we observe in turbulent times.
Thank you.
That's great. So, I mean, I've got a question as well. I mean, we've got some time, but maybe we'll make this the last question unless anybody really wants to ask another question. And that is, we obviously live in very difficult times for businesses at the moment, given the pandemic over the last 12 months. And I just wondered what your view is on the impact on SMEs and or small businesses in terms of the withdrawal of the furlough government support in September or in a couple of months' time, whether businesses are really hanging on by their fingernails or whether they will manage that storm that is about to happen in a couple of months' time.
I don't know. I wish I knew. I guess it's all about the timing here. The only thing we know for sure, because you asked specifically about family SMEs, is that family SMEs typically are less capitalized than other businesses, so they have more financial constraints, right? Yeah. So whenever there's a shortage of cash, they struggle more. That's a fact. If the follow support ends in a time in which they have good access to financing, either from the banking system or from their business operations, mm-hmm. I think they should be okay. If that is not the case, that could be a problem, right? So it's all in the timing, actually. Okay. I think I lean towards being optimistic here, for a reason. There's a big difference between this crisis and any other crisis we have faced before 2008. Is that most traditional economic theory on theory in economic cycles, crises happen because there's excess credit and excess debt in the economy. Yeah. And then there's less funding available and less expenditure because basically there's a lot of debt that have to be assimilated. Yeah. In this case, what has happened is kind of the opposite. Because of COVID and the lockdown, people haven't spent the money they had. So there's a big accumulated saving in the economy. Okay. So when things go back to normal, when the restrictions are lifted, that money should flow again. And we have experienced that with people just rushing to spend all the money they couldn't have spent before. Yeah. The same should apply to the banking system. So there was no business investment for at all in 1 year. The monies banks were not lending money because no one was taking any borrowing, any borrowed money. So I would assume that the financial system should have the capacity to fund businesses when things go back to normal. Okay, that's great. Well, let's leave it on this optimal positive note going forward. Let's hope that small businesses in particular will ride the storm over the next few months. And I think I would like to thank you once again, Antonio, for taking us through quite a few areas. Duncan, do you want to ask one final question?
It's on the screen there. It's on the chat. Yeah. Do family businesses underline the trust that forms an important principle in cooperatives? Are family businesses natural cooperatives? Well, that's actually a very good question as well. Right. I talked about socio-emotional wealth before, and funnily enough, the first article that developed that concept was made on small family-run Spanish olive oil mills. And what they found is that family-run olive oil mills were less likely to join cooperatives than non-family businesses. And even though that meant a risk for the business at that point. And that's the idea that in this case, the family socio-emotional wealth could actually prevent the managers to make decisions that were good for the business. Basically, the whole point here is a matter of control. And it's kind of similar to the idea of going public into the market. If you join a cooperative, somehow you are sharing control of your business with the cooperative. And that may be an issue, actually. Yes. This idea of who owns the company, who controls the company, who makes decisions. Yeah. And that's perhaps the main issue there. That's good. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, listen, so we've come to the end of another very interesting lecture. And again, if I could ask you all once more to unmute and give Antonio another round of applause, that would be much appreciated. Oh, thank you very much indeed. So I think I'm just going to leave you now with just the details of next month's talk, which is by Andrew Sturdy from the University of Bristol, and he's going to talk about management consultancies. And the question is, are they governable? So that should be an interesting topic to discuss. Very topical as well at the moment. So I'll leave you with that. That's the June talk. And in the meantime, as I always end with this thing, is stay healthy, stay safe, and most importantly of all, stay sane. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.